Four Arrows. Welcome to the Better World Leaders podcast.
It's my pleasure, my privilege.
Well, this really is an honor and a privilege to be here with you. Sort of straight out of the gate, I would acknowledge that your work, along with your co-author, co-editor, co-analyst, one of the deepest, most moving and both inspiring and informative books that I read last year. And Restoring the Kinship Worldview was called out by an Indigenous professor who works a lot with decolonizing futures here in Australia in a course that I was in, and with him saying, I don't know if anybody will have come across this yet. It's pretty new and really, really highly recommended. Yin Paradies is his name. In the middle of last year, and I was able to literally pick it up off my desk and go, oh yes, it's amazing. I'm reading it right now. So thank you for this magnificent gift to the world and all beings. And again, it's a privilege and an honor to be here with you discussing that work.
Well, thank you. You know, we've been doing this work for a long time. I say we, both Darshan and I have. Of course, I've been doing it for years, even before that. And it seems like people are starting to awaken to the reality that our fundamental worldview is what's driving the problems and preventing the solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So much to discuss. And as we move forward, may we introduce ourselves to each other and to whoever's listening, because this is the first time we've met, albeit virtually. So would you go first, please?
I'd be honored. Yeah. So Wahinkpe Topa Machiapi Elo. I'd say my name is Four Arrows. Don Trent Jacobs is my Irish name, but I've gone by my spiritual name for many years. That was given to me by the Oglala Lakota, and one of the 7 sacred ceremonies of the Lakota, which includes the sun dance, the vision quest, and the purification lodge. My ancestry is mostly Irish. We have historical stories and pictures of a Cherokee great-grandmother, but never was that part of my existence. After I got out of the U.S. Marine Corps in the Vietnam era, I sort of had a chip on my shoulder I used for whitewater adventures and wild horse training, and had a near-death experience in central Mexico trying to kayak down the Rio River. As a result of that, I spent time with the Raramuri Cimarron people. Was blown away by, in spite of them living in caves, the richness of their culture, the generosity, the conflict resolutions, the whole thing. So when I came back, I had a vision, and the vision brought me to change from a sports psychologist to going back to university and studying Indigenous worldview. Became Dean of Education at Oglala Lakota College, did my Sundance vows, became a relative, as I said, and so started writing books about this thing that we call Indigenous worldview, which we'll talk later about how I make a distinction between that and place-based knowledge. It's an important distinction. But so that's pretty much it. I live in Mexico. I'm a professor at Fielding Graduate University now, so I can live in Mexico. And I've got 4 grandchildren, and they're visiting me here now. And married to a beautiful woman who is an artist. And my favorite activities are playing polo and surfing.
Okay, wow. All right, well, I will attempt to reciprocate. First of all, by acknowledging the First Peoples of the Dharawal country upon which I stand, which is a custom in Australia. I am of Welsh and English ancestry and have lived most of the life that I would consider to be agentic in this world in Australia. I moved here as a young man and have had the vast majority of my adult life here. I have had a kind of similar, in a way, I suppose, sort of tangential experience, starting off as something of an anthropologist and always working with people in the context of organizations. And then through relationship with lots of place-based, and to acknowledge and seek to understand more, but sensing a little bit into the contrast and comparison with Indigenous wisdom, through a series of experiences with place-based and fortunately deep relationship with Indigenous people here in Australia, come to sense into things differently. Have had several, not quite as dramatic as yours, which you describe in detail in your work, but have had several encounters that could have been the end of this version of my being lineage, including PTSD episodes in what psychologists call ecological trauma, which have really brought me to doing the work the way that I do it, and sort of seeking to shift at a sort of really consciousness and cultural level the things that I recognize in myself need to change in order to be a different being, and one which is more orientated towards sustaining life. So we will get to know each other a little bit more as our relationship begins in this conversation, but I'll rest my introduction there.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing this idea up of the sort of a post-trauma stress relating to the experience of recognizing the devastation of our world and our ecological system. I mentioned to you, my daughter has a group of teenagers here, and I'm noticing in the kind of behaviors and the consciousness of that this seems to be subtle in some places and severe in some places, but I'm starting to notice it. And you're the first interview that I've done where someone has mentioned that, and I think it's an important thing. Maybe we can come back to. I think it's going to increase, and I think recognizing it early is a door to open, and there's not a whole lot written on it.
Yeah, 100%. So yes, two things we're ready to come back to. So how would you like to begin? What should we discuss first?
Just one thing real briefly. I just grabbed this because you're in Australia, and I just wanted to let you know that a friend of mine who's an Australian Aboriginal did the cover for my book, The Red Road, about linking diversity and inclusion initiatives to Indigenous worldview instead of going out and hiring chief diversity officers, which don't work. But anyway, he did this painting and a song line, and he describes it inside. So I just wanted to let you know that I have some connections to your country in that way.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe the place to start is with the complicated and complex idea of worldview, and maybe we can get through that so we can get more from our head to our heart in this. But the idea of a worldview, I would be real brief and try to be as non-academic as I can. It was a sort of a sentence or two that came out of German philosophy, and it was Weltanschauung, and it kind of meant a deep intuition of the world is how it was intended then. And it caught on like wildfire, and everybody started talking about worldview, but people used it for almost everything until eventually around the Enlightenment in the 1800s, it was pretty much a debate between science and religion, which worldview was right. In fact, today, if you put in worldview in Amazon.com or something like that, 90% of the thousands of books on it will be religious books claiming to their religion is a worldview. But even scholars tend to be all over the place with it. Philosophies are worldviews, cultures can be worldviews, modernism and neo-modernism and theism, all these kinds of things. But over the years, as I've looked at worldview, I bumped into Robert Redfield out of the University of Chicago's work, and he's considered the father of social anthropology. And he brought the word and the concept into scholarship and out of sort of just general philosophy. And he really defined it as the relationship between the natural world that we call nature, even though we tend to see ourselves as outside of it, and humans, and what he might call he called supernatural, or the mystical world, the metaphysical world, the spirit world. And he said that's the fundamental source of our morality, is our relationship to the trees, the animals, to the cosmos, and to each other. And so with that, he, in the 20s and 30s, said there's three worldviews. There's the Eastern one, the Western one, and the primitive one, he called it. And I think the Western one he called the civilized one or something. Or no, the cosmopolitan, he called it. After around 1950, his team at the University of Chicago of anthropologists and social anthropologists said, Eastern still has spiritual traditions that are coming much closer to indigenous spirituality, but they've pretty much subsumed the general manifestations of the dominant worldview in terms of materialism and hierarchy and anthropocentrism. And I mean, even in Buddhist reincarnation theory, you don't come back as an animal very often, right? And so he said there's two worldviews. And he thought the greatest tragedy in the history of humanity was the deafening overshadowing of the indigenous worldview with what I call the dominant worldview. But even if you don't find a scholar who really talks about the two worldviews, or there being two worldviews like Darcia and I do, when you listen to dialogue and discussions about worldview, they almost always boil down to, this is my worldview chart of the 40 precepts, they boil down to talking about hierarchy or non-hierarchy, about anthropocentrism or non-anthropocentrism, about spirituality and materialism, as if, and this is how we think of it, our left side of the brain activity, which is our right hand, is the dominant worldview. And our right hemisphere brain activity, which is our left hand, is the indigenous worldview. So we look at our chart not as a rigid binary, because the indigenous worldview itself, one of the precepts is it's a dualistic, non-binary worldview where we see the potential for complementarity in opposites. So when people look at this chart, it's not like even though the left side has us at the edge of a mass extinction, it's not that one is bad and one is good. It's that we're out of balance. And that's how we are looking at the worldview precepts that we can talk about today, and how now Veterans for Peace has contacted me with an interest in decolonizing via these worldview precepts. Lots of other, a college in Haiti is doing it for their whole doctoral program in educational philosophy. So folks are starting to see this as the greater good science center out of the University of California, Berkeley, who just nominated or selected our book as one of 15 of the books that do three things. One is thought-provoking, the other one was practical, and the other one was inspirational. And it's these worldview precepts that we can every day look and say, wow, how much have I been overly in this dominant worldview in my education, my entertainment, my thinking, my economics, my folklore, and how much is that keeping me in this problem that I am in, or my community is in, or our world is in. So so that's kind of what this book did, is we took 28 of the 40 precepts, and people are starting to say, we want a book on the other precepts now, but we took 28 of them and we found very good quotes from very respected indigenous voices to say something that kind of defines that in a storyfied way. And then Darcia and I, we kind of jump in and have a dialogue about how to implement this in each one of the precepts in our lives. And so it seems to have a good formula for working.
Oh, I think it's a brilliant formula. So, I mean, I've begun with praise. So at risk of, sort of coming off as sycophantic, I'll try and keep the praise to a minimal amount. But just to describe my experience with the book, I felt as if I was witnessing that dialogue And I think, only being familiar with a couple of the holders of Indigenous wisdom who you include and dialogue with, being Robin Wall Kimmerer and Tyson Yunkaporta, all of the other voices in here were new to me, or I was aware of them, but only in a very, very sort of distal and unfamiliar way. But I didn't know what to expect. Sort of the book was recommended, and I just went out and engaged with it straight away. But I was kind of surprised, but in a very pleasant and engaging way, when I got to the part of the first precept where I discovered that this was essentially a conversation in print, that I immediately felt that I was witnessing, and it made the navigation of the text for me something I really looked forward to spending time with. And it's a fascinating dialogue between the two of you, and the playfulness and the willingness to sort of say, well, I'm not too sure about that, or
Right,
I have
yeah,
a different
we
view,
did
right?
that.
You're not just sitting there
Yeah.
going, oh, well said, and yes, I agree entirely, right?
Okay.
It's a really active dialogue. It's fabulous.
Yeah, and that's how we had it. We didn't try to be academic about it, or we really just got into it, and we had not done that before, so it was original for us as well. I had done a dialogue book once before. It's kind of interesting and plays into our conversation for your audience. There was a man who is a economics professor at Loyola. Walter Block is his name, and well published, and I have glanced at some of his work, and I just recoiled with everything he's ever said. He refers to himself as a Jewish atheist libertarian, and has a view that social ecological justice should never be taught in higher education, and against labor unions, and all this kind of stuff, right? And so I called him up and I said, look, we're both professors, we've both written a number of books. Can we have a dialogue? Can we write a book together? I can get a contract where we can't debate, just try to win each other. We have to do cooperative argumentation so that we try to learn from each other. And he wound up agreeing. We actually became good friends, and folks can go on YouTube and put in St. Louis University Doer Social Justice Center and watch one of our presentations. And what was cool at the book signing, he had more fans than I did, because it was a pretty conservative place. But they would come up to me and they would, ask me to sign the book, and they'd say, like, for a lefty, you're not too bad, or something like that, right? And then my folks would go up to him and say, I still really disagree with you thinking that only humans have intrinsic value and everything else is utilitarian. But by golly, you were up there, and you've listened to us, and you guys, Now, not everybody agreed with that. I gave the book to a very famous person who was a friend of mine in Mexico, Alice Walker of The Color Purple. And she threw it in a waste can right in front of me. Said, "You're in bed with the devil," So not everybody agrees, right? But we talk about every subject imaginable that relates to indigenous worldview or his worldview. Which, what was remarkable for me is that when he said, for example, what I told you, I had said to him when we were talking about animal protection, he said, well, if you want to protect animals, you have to privatize. And I said, well, how do you privatize whales? And he said, well, you can do this. And I said, Walter, I just trying to understand here. It sounds like you believe only humans have intrinsic value and everything. And he wrote back, and I thought, I'd get a new slant, but instead he said, I'm really surprised you asked that. I've been enjoying this writing, but I'm surprised because, well, of course, only humans have intrinsic value. Everything on the earth is utilitarian. Well, what hit me was, Tim, that this is really the foundation of most people's thinking, whether they think about it or not, right? And so, that dialogue really kind of prompted me to go to somebody who was, on my side of things and have a dialogue, because my wife said, don't ever do that other one again. So, but yeah, it was I think, when we start looking at the fundamental worldview, how is that hierarchical? How is that not seeing sentience and other than humans? How is it? Pretty soon, and we can't pick and choose. We've got to look at all of these. We've got to ask ourselves, in what way does he not see complementary duality, and looks at dualistic thinking instead? And why does he have an emphasis more on rights than on responsibility? Why does he see standing up to someone or fighting as the highest expression of courage instead of generosity being the highest expression? And if you look at these worldview precepts, when you encounter things that you go, I can't believe the president is doing this, or that these people are doing this, and you look at that, you start to see that they are on the other side of the brain on too many of these things, and that's where we've got to get back to if we're going to really make change.
Yeah. So there's a lot, sort of emerging for me that I'm trying to sort of grasp at all the little sort of fractals and decide how I would invite the conversation to proceed. And there's one thing that's really sort of salient and is right here, right now, in this initial dialogue around worldview, which is this beautiful term which just sort of jumped straight off the page when I first saw it, that really, I think, for me, brilliantly encapsulates the comparison between the sort of the simplistic and sort of quite well, I'm just going to say blinkered worldview that is dominant, and the much more expansive, more deep and just sort of boundless in potential to connect with all of the vastness that you're describing, which is this world sense. So I'd love for you to say just a little bit about this framing that you offer pretty early on. I think it may even be in the introduction in the book, about really, when you're referring to indigenous worldview, there's a different way of even saying what it is, and it's a world sense.
Right. Darcy and I, we chose kinship worldview as our title instead of indigenous worldview because of the misunderstandings that one gets about, well, is this about only indigenous people own it? Is this a theft of indigeneity? All those kinds of things. The worldview that is a nature-based kinship worldview is our original way we understood the world before we moved away from nature. And made ourselves superior. I mean, many dictionaries will say that if you look up the word nature, they'll say it's everything that was not made by humans or is human. And so we're really locked into that. To jump over to New Zealand's idea of Wahinkpe Topa, it's a Maori term that really is quite amazing. I mean, it's an idea that encompasses kinships in just about every way that you can imagine it. The idea of it is quite remarkable in terms of its complexity and how it's a source of interconnectedness with everything from ritual and mythology and philosophy and psychology, and so the sense of the world isn't really a view. It's more of a feeling, and so we don't really like the word. In my book, Unlearning the Language of Conquest, back in 2001, I invited a scholar to challenge the word, and he started out by really challenging why indigenous people do not really see the world. They are in the world, right? But we've kind of redefined it, and because it's on the consciousness of a lot of people, we're using it. I mean, even the seventh astronaut to walk on the moon, he looked down at the Earth and came back and founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And he said only a handful of visionaries know that the indigenous worldview is the solution to returning balance to Mother Earth. So this term Wahinkpe Topa, I mean, it's a framework that links the animate and the inanimate, the known and the unknown, the mysterious, in both the terrestrial and the spiritual worlds. It binds everything. It binds and maps relationships, mythologies, legends, history, knowledge, and so, you know, if we really start to just say, wait a minute, everything we do in life, there's one of these combinations of moral precepts that relate us as interconnected and relational or not. And that, you know, and we'll get into cat fawn, which was the vision that I had on the river, which was a simplification of how taking 4 of these worldview ideas that relate to fear, authority, words, and nature for the fawn acronym, and how once we do metacognition to recognize how, wow, we could do this so much better if we could move more over to our right brain and to our indigenous approach, or the kinship nature approach. But then to get it deep into our brain cells, willful determination doesn't work, as every gold medalist in every Olympics knows who uses sports hypnosis. You've got to imagine it. And we then use CAT, concentration activated transformation. So we'll come back to that little story, because that's a tool that people can walk away with after this presentation and start using right away. And of course, they can go to Kindred Spirits Worldview to look at the worldview charts and download it, or you know, get a big chart, but start using that as well.
Well, so here's a question. If someone is at this juncture, you're curious, and this is all very new to them, you know, they're chosen to listen to this, and yeah, perhaps they've engaged with some of, you know, like I had, you know, some of the writings of some of the other people. Where would you suggest they begin?
I would begin really with learning from whatever plants and animals are around you right now. And I mean, I did a little thing with the teenagers yesterday. I said, I want everybody to walk over those groups of trees and plants over there and just pick one out and touch it and come back. So they got up and walked over and touched it and come back. And then I said, okay, now you guys are gonna laugh. I want you to do it again, but this time I want you to kind of take a deep breath, get down into maybe a little bit lower meditative brainwave frequency. Even if you've never done it, just kind of take a breath and focus. And remember that your breath is in partnership with the ocean, which is 90 steps from here. And they're all smart enough to know how that works, oxygen and carbon dioxide, but they hadn't thought of it, as most of us haven't. And I said, now stand in front of that tree. I want you this time, before you touch it, to ask permission. And of course, they all laughed a little. And I said, oh, if you laughed at that, you're going to maybe really laugh at this. I want you to wait for permission. I want you to wait for an answer. And so, man, you know, some of them, you know, pretty tough cookies, and they kind of shook their head. But when they came back, all but a couple of them really reported out the same things that I've done with this exercise over the years. Not hearing with their ears something, but waiting, and then had storylines to tell about it that were pretty remarkable. I've done it in rooms with teachers that cried when they heard some of their kids do it. I said, that's how the indigenous peoples who haven't lost these ways, which unfortunately is happening way too often. My Navajo students tell me that, and that's the largest reservation and First Nation in the United States, all of them in the doctoral program with me are saying that 70 to 85% of the people that no longer have this worldview, and the languages are being lost, which, you know, the language is about the teachings of trees and the idea. And so if your reader says, okay, just don't do anything else, but just start paying attention to the plant life and the foods you eat and the things that are from nature, and start to think about how they're taking care of you, not vice versa, and how if they have sentience, people have got Western books out now, like The Secret Life of Trees and things like this that are showing it. Well, us, the sun dancers of the Lakota, they've known this from time immemorial. We said when we go out to chop a tree down, we're told from the tree what its relatives are, to go and ask permission from them. And we, men with scars all over their chest cry like babies about dropping a tree, because it's going to symbolically, as we symbolically die, it's going to really die in that Sundance arena, right? So yeah, I say just start thinking about the food you eat, the trees around you. Go out and get in touch with it. Just sit and meditate. Watch some pigeons on the street, and see that pecking order really isn't hierarchical, because everybody ultimately gets their fair share. Start really looking at the idea that instead of referring to a natural resource as such, refer to a natural resource as a relative, a good relative, and a teacher.
Okay. Well, that is a good start. And I would share so something as simple an exercise as when I first read Braiding Sweetgrass, I started my own version, and an appropriation maybe, but it's offered in the work of the honorable harvest, right? Like in the garden where things are growing through a combination of me putting them there and everything else nurturing them, because I don't do terribly much, because I find I don't need to, or it's actually better if I don't. But just not speaking out loud, I find that actually doesn't work. It feels insincere in some way, but certainly expressing my version. I'm not appropriating the Haudenosaunee words exactly, but expressing my version of gratitude for the growth that is there, and asking permission, and taking what is needed, and leaving more than enough, not just for the plant to survive, but for the kindreds that are also sort of part of the life in this place, the birds and the possums and whatever else comes by. And I've found a real gain in doing that. But just that's the only way I can do, like a real energetic gain where I seem to thrive more, and so does everything else. And that sounds incredibly like simple.
Yeah, I love the concept of that, and the idea of when you're in the wild and you're searching for berries, don't go grab the first ones you see, right?
Yeah.
I introduced Dorsha and I invited Robin to our national conference, and your viewers can just go to YouTube and put in Sustainable Wisdom Conference Notre Dame, Robin Kimmerer, and I introduced her, and she gives a really good presentation in person. Of course, she just won the MacArthur Foundation Award for her work. I want to I really respect and honor and hear how you're wanting to avoid misappropriation of indigeneity, and so I don't forget it later. I think a lot of your listeners will wonder about, how much of this can I use and teach without playing Indian, without misappropriating, knowing, one of my favorite jokes, I'll tell you real quick. So that'll set the stage for what I'm going to say. So there was a Lakota boy out with his grandfather, and they were learning how to mix colors from plants for doing artwork. And they saw a couple of spacemen on their land, and the old grandfather said, "Go see what those guys are doing, who they are." So they went over, and there were a couple of astronauts in their moon outfit practicing for a journey to the moon, and told the boy, and he said, "This land that you're on here is very similar to what we feel the moon's going to be in terms of texture and terrain." So he went and told his grandfather, and his grandfather said, So his grandfather grabbed some parchment off of an old dead cactus and got some colors that he had already made, and got a spine, and wrote a letter. And And so he sent that to the boy and says, give this to them and have them take it to the moon. And so boy did that. Now there was a big conference before the moon launching, and all the top guys at National Aeronautic Space Administration, all the senators and everybody was there, and they had the translator translate it, and no one had read it yet, and they asked the translator to hand it to him, and the guy did, kind of reluctantly, and he took it and he opened it up, and it said, dear moon people, watch these guys. They've come to steal your land, your children, and your spirituality. All right, so we can all agree that that's happening. However, Indian country is divided. Indigenous people are divided. I've got dear friends that are divided. And on almost everything that relates, for example, to bringing this into education, to talking about this on your show. And so I honor and respect both sides and understand both sides very well. But I tend to feel that there's too much anger and fear on the side that's saying don't do it. Fool's Crow, one of the great Lakota wisdom keepers, says if you're not willing to share this medicine, you don't know the medicine. White Standing Buffalo was with us and with Robin at our Notre Dame presentation. And right after our first day, some of the people we had invited said, I think we're saying too much to this white audience. I'm not comfortable with it. And oh man, I thought, here we go again. And that's why I had brought White Standing Buffalo. He was the only non-academic. And I said, no, he's got to come, and he's a Sundance chief up in Canada for the Cree. And sure enough, I just said, I passed it to him. I said, can you speak to this, White Standing Buffalo? And he did, and he said pretty much the same thing. And the people totally said, okay, that makes sense to me, right? And we went forward. I wrote an article about this that people can read online easily by just putting in the indigenization controversy, for whom, by whom, where we talk about this. And so I would just say in closing of that idea or that fear of misappropriation is, yes, everything's been misappropriated, and bringing this into education and all that, and having people practice indigenous worldview is at risk to some degree of alienating and saying, well, we don't need the indigenous people because we're doing it out of our podcast, right? There's a risk of that, a small risk. But if people make a distinction between place-based knowledge and indigenous worldview and go, wait, place-based knowledge is irreplaceable and being lost, and we've got to fight for the sovereignty of people that have it. And that's the unique exact ceremonies and how to do them that relate to the land. That's the language that is of the land. And that's multi-generations in one place, right? But we're losing that. We've got to face that. And here's the rest of us. What do we do if we can't find someone? Well, the worldview is the answer, because worldview is what the great unique diversity of indigenous cultures around the world have in common. And I've lived with many, and that's the biggest thing I notice, is that in spite of a very different belief system about this or that, or this, I just see, my God, that's exactly the same as we do. I was with the Kogi Mamas, or the Kumkak of Sonora, the Raramuri, and this is worldview. And who does that belong to? Anyone who is indigenous to planet Earth. And so we've got to realize that this, whether you want to call it being an ally, like at Standing Rock, or whether it's that, no, I want to re-indigenize myself to this place because there's no one here that knows anything about it anymore. And, or I want to do my best. Worldview is the start of that. And I don't really have, and maybe this is something you want to cut out, but I don't really have hope that we're going to turn things around. I was up at British Columbia just before the pandemic, speaking at the College of Education, and someone asked me at the end, so for us, you think that if everyone really begins this shift of balancing the worldview precepts, that we can turn things around. And I said, no, I don't think we can. It's possible, but I truly don't believe it. I'm not counting on it. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen. I think we're moving into our fifth world, and it's not going to be easy. And they went kind of from loving me to hating me in that moment, right? And then the hands went up, and somebody said, well, why are you here? And I said, well, I wrote a little booklet called Sitting Bull's Words for a World in Crisis. I chose him because when he was interviewed once, people asked him how, when smallpox had killed almost all your people, the buffalo had all been, you were still singing, writing poetry, doing ceremony, being generous, doing this, learning this. Then you went and became he said, because I want to be a human being. And my spirit that is in my body, like everyone else's, is here to experience being a human being and all of the gifts that we have been given as children of this Mother Earth. And I don't know how or what the long picture is or whether how I'm coming back, but that's my job. That's my job. And so I like to say that hope should not be a expectation of an outcome, but instead the certainty that regardless of the outcome, what you're doing is the right thing to do. And that's where the worldview comes into play.
So we're 100% keeping this. Like this is the beauty of these conversations. The depth it's possible to explore when you show up and you talk about what's really in your heart and what your spirit wants to sing. I agree with you. And I think for me, the questions that I think are most important to ask are, what is it that is lost? What is it that we are losing? And how do we want to be in spite of what is not going to be here? And I think the process, and maybe this is a bridge to just a brief segue and interruption in my own train of thought. I think something that I would love for us to do would be to together select a few of the precepts and do a sort of a deeper dive into a few of them, right? So maybe this is a segue into one of them, that's sort of the part about really sort of understanding death. I think the process in life, which is never ending, as a perpetual cycle, that has helped me the most manage my anger and fear about where we're at and what's happening and where we're headed, is the process of grief. And the experiences of grief that I've had in my life have helped me grieve for our worlds and grieve for the futures which are no longer possible, and remain as resolute and steadfast as I can about moving towards the most possible version of the futures that we still can.
I think that's beautifully said. And you said briefly before I think we started the recording about how there is a new form of post-trauma stress disorder that relates to the recognition and the mourning of visiting a place that you were at once before, and now you see it's decimated, or any of the things that we know that are going on, or just knowing that things are, being destroyed in ways that are pretty much, off the chart of what you have. Many of the indigenous worldview precepts, they get us to that place of fearlessness of death. This idea of fearlessness really is not seen in Western literature, although Gandhi is one of the few that did talk about it. fearlessness in Socrates' world and many philosophers after him is foolishness. But I say that, well, courage takes a lot of energy, but it's honored and very honored and in the traditional way. And many people in all cultures honor it. But you can burn out with too much, facing too much and using courage too often, until you learn how to move from courage into this fearless trust of the universe that allows you that definition of hope that I gave. And so what is that? What's an example of that? Well, let's say you see a bunch of my grandchildren jumping off a 30-foot cliff into this waterfall. And you go, wow, that looks safe. Nobody has gotten hurt yet. And I'd like to do it, but I'm afraid of heights. And so let's say I talk you into it and I get your courage up. And now you climb up the mountain, and you get on this ledge and you're looking down and whoa, it's pretty scary. But you still, let's say you still are mustering that courage in an honorable way. And you jump all the way down. You're kind of screaming and you're hoping, and and you hit and you go, oh, thank God, and you swim out. But if I could get you to move beyond that courage and to fearless engagement, now you walk up to that cliff and it's still taking courage. You still feel the fear. But as soon as you're committed to an action, and in this case, it would be jumping, you're done with the courage. You are now, I trust the world no matter what. Now you see the eagle fly overhead. You see the salmon that swims underneath you. You feel the air flowing, and it's almost like slow motion. You feel the plunge in the bubbles of the water. And, that's where we've got to get. So I have people, when we finish our Anipi ceremony, we did one today and we did this. I have people, I say, if you would like to do this, walk silently out to the ocean. It's a user-friendly ocean. The waves are small. And imagine as soon as your feet touch the water that this is your moment of dying. Whether you're getting hit by a truck, dying of heart disease or old age, or how long in the future it is, I want you to practice dying. And so when you hit that water, no hesitation, no, even if it's cold, just keep moving forward. And when you allow yourself to plunge in the water, imagine the beauty that me and people that have had near-death experiences, and there have been thousands recorded by Ray Moody and others. The University of Virginia has recorded thousands. Undescribable light, undescribable musical feeling, seeing your ancestors and others waiting for you, all these things, just imagine the beauty of it and allow yourself to, do that for a few seconds and then get out. And you can do that in the house with a cold shower maybe or whatever. But I think what you're saying is really a vital component, and believing that in these worldview precepts we're going to have to help a lot of people get through whatever it is ahead of us. And it's your unique person that has some special way that you can help with that. Nobody knows what it is, whether you're an artist or whether you're doing podcast, or whether everybody has a unique way to help people through this, so that we don't look like these post-apocalyptic movies you see in Hollywood, where somebody has got a machine gun bullet rack on him and he's replicating, starting over what it is that caused the problem in the first place, right? And so let's get that to change. The Hopi, the Maya, the Lakota, a number of First Nations believe in that humans have made this mistake 3 times before. And, you've heard of the fifth world and the fourth world, and that we have gotten, we've allowed our imagination to carry us into really exciting places with technology, but we've forgotten and arrogantly put ourselves separate from nature in so doing. Now, we had a lot of inventions before. 13,000 years in the Amazon rainforest, black earth was invented, places, corn was invented, which a physicist recently said is the greatest invention ever. The only thing that requires humans to grow again. But we always thought about the greater good. We always thought about that. And And so we're going to need people to rebuild if things go south, and we'll probably be around for that to happen. We're going to need people to help, to inspire people to remember that they are not human bodies seeking a soul experience. They are souls, they are spirits in a human body that is saying, this is the experience I have chosen. Let's make the best of it, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I think within just one thing that's coming up for me, as we're talking specifically about this, and not to dwell on any of the things that may be confronting you, whomever is listening to this right now, but I think it's one of the things which, again, has shifted in my view, that now when I see it in others, I see as this repetition of an endorsement of the worldview which has got us into this problem, this separation between people and nature within the climate movement, of well-intentioned people saying, "Oh, don't worry, the Earth will be fine." It's people who are going to suffer here, and that is in contrast to so much of my understanding of First Peoples worldviews. And there's Aboriginal friends that I have here who say, no, it's the absence of people from the land which is making country sick. And whether that's because of industrial ag, or the privatization and propertyization of country, or because of well-intentioned white folk who've set up national parks and then said, well, don't go in there and don't cut stuff down. And but it's the lack of the relationship with people as stewards and custodians of land which is actually causing so many of the problems. And Carol Sanford, one of my greatest guides, she sort of rages about this as much as she ever does in her writings, and kind of goes, no, like this is a sort of a false precept that the planet will be fine after humans have gone away. If we don't right this wrong, like we need to relearn and re-intuit our relationship with this place, because we're part of it and interdependent with it.
I was guilty. I'll confess, I was guilty of maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago, saying things about humans being like a cancer on this earth. And
me too, for sure.
Yeah, and I've learned, and although functionally maybe there are some parallels, I've learned from being with original peoples and from my studies that, we are children of Earth just like every other creature, and that the interrelationship, and I had mentioned the studies of the Amazon rain basin, that those 13 years, there was not just a few naked people running around and not having any impact. There were cities that were bigger than those in Europe at the time, and the impact was tremendous. But it was these good impacts without species annihilation, and the Black Earth being one of them. That's become more and more popular and knowledge, and so you're right, I believe, and the indigenous peoples are right, that this is we're destined to do this. Now, if we do believe the mythologies of the Hopi and the Navajo, the Mayas, they say we've only got 7 opportunities for this, 7 worlds. And that, if we are in the 4th world and we are moving to the 5th world, now who knows? The world could be 18,000 years of the cycle, or it could be 1 million. We don't know any of this stuff. It's probably impossible to figure it out. But, we do know how long the first one, they say it was fire. The second one was an ice age, and the third one was a flood. So we can kind of get a sense of the amount of time in between. And so it doesn't mean that, like the dinosaurs, there ain't a possibility, that we're going to go, but it isn't something that we want to wish for, and it's not going to be a good thing. And that's one of the problems with the REDD program and carbon, exchanges with corporations. They say, oh, well, we got to remove the indigenous people from that area so that it is oh my gosh, that's the worst thing that you can do. It's the worst thing you can do. So it's a
Yeah.
good point.
Yeah. 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 No, I think it's definitely no coincidence that whatever the statistic is accurately, but somewhere in the region of 80% of non-human diversity exists in country that's custodianed by indigenous people, right? And
80% of
80%.
all biodiversity is on only 20% of the landmass. I mean, that's the staggering thing just to think of that. 80% of biodiversity on only 20% of the landmass. And it's not all over the place. It's on places, like you say, that are managed by indigenous worldview. When I read that in the 2019 biodiversity report, it was on the front page of every paper in the world for a day, but it scared people so much because they said 1 million more species will go extinct of flora and fauna in the next generation. And that's just too frightening to hold on to. But I got the whole manuscript and I read it, and I was blown away that 7 times it was said where indigenous worldview is operating and people have a degree of control over the land, this extinction rate is non-existing or severely retarded. Man, I typed that up and I thought, who is not, I can get this published to say. So I called The Nation, which is the oldest journal in the United States, the oldest progressive journal in the United States. And I talked them into it. And if people go on Google, they just put in 4 arrows, The Nation. And the title of the article was the urgent message from the United Nations biodiversity report that the media did not cover, something like that, because this is science. This is 450 multidisciplinary scientists from 50 countries, 15,000 peer-reviewed papers saying that it's our nature-based kinship worldview that has proven itself as reducing biodiversity loss. I mean, if you don't want to listen to anything else and you're a Western scientist, man, listen to that.
Absolutely. So I'm getting now for the first time, because it's been such a beautiful sort of encapsulating dialogue, but I'm getting conscious of our time for the first time. And I definitely would love to explore cat fawn in conversation with you, its creator, and I would really love to explore just a couple of the precepts. And I mean, when I started re-reviewing this in anticipation of this conversation, I started thinking about, which ones would I really like? And I sort of was struggling to find one not to talk about. But is there anything that particularly calls to you that would complement the conversation we've already had as one or two of the precepts to have a little deeper dive into?
I think that the cat fawn would be a better way to go, because it will kind of do the same thing with 4 sort of general of the precepts. Because, and here's why I say that. I am having students and the Veterans for Peace and everybody, look at and pick out ones that you feel that you are kind of violating, but I want them to pick it out, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so, are you in a rigid hierarchy? Are you more materialistic than you want to be? Do you see Earth as an unloving it, as opposed to the options on the other side of the chart, right?
Beautiful. Okay, so let's do this then.
A self-exercise, right? Whereas cat fawn, which was really did come to me after my near-death experience as a vision that maybe change everything. It takes and combines some of them into the fawn, which is, how is the different worldview in about fear related to our life and our problems? How is a different worldview about authority, which there's 2 or 3 precepts that relate to authority on it? And how is our precepts about words? And there's 2 or 3 here about truthfulness and honesty. And how is our worldview about nature? And there's maybe 6 about that on here. So those are condensed, and it came to me because on the Rio Urique, we were in a cave after I went through this hole in the river, trying to escape the river in a canyon that you couldn't climb out of, and a mountain lion called an onça walked over our sleeping bags. Another friend of mine that was with me and showed us the way out, and that was the cat, C-A-T, which in my vision turned into letters. The fawn was the Rawarumuri actually are known for their running, the Tarahumara as they're called. and they ran a deer down, and the feet were, a baby deer, a fawn, the feet were bleeding. And so those two animals came in, and the animals turned into neon lights in New York City or someplace. And that was my vision, cat fawn. And many years and going back again there to really understand it, made me realize that that cat is this phenomenon of ceremony and trance-based learning. Indigenous people have done healing with trance-based learning since time immemorial, and there's been many books written on it. In the early days, anthropologists thought it was fakery because they would take worms out of the dirt and come in and do a ceremony and act as if they were sucking worms out. Well, they knew, the patient knew that. That was the imagery to help with the imaginative healing. CAT, concentration activated trance, most of our problems come from our first 5 years of childhood when we're in a hypnotic state almost the whole time. That's why we can learn 10 languages if we learn them in those times, right? And so we are plagued with a misunderstanding of trance-based learning and self-actualization. Maslow got it wrong. If you put in Maslow and the Blackfoot, you'll see how he got it wrong, that we're born with this phenomenon of being able to use it. Well, ceremony is lower brainwave frequency and imagining and intention. That's all hypnosis is. People can do it themselves. They don't have to pay somebody. And I write about that in my books and how to do that, right? And get a pendulum spinning and the ideomotor neurons working, then you're in hypnosis and have an equal statement ready to go. And by golly, if that pendulum keeps going, it's like paying me $400 to hypnotize you, right? But or do ceremony and go in and do it, participate in a ceremony with an intention. That's hypnosis. It's healing. It's powerful. So that's got to be the tool that's going to move you into indigenous worldview, not willful determination. All right, with setting that aside, now we're going to look at what are 4 of the main kinds of ideas that get us in trouble. Well, the Western concept of fear. Boy, we don't like fear. We avoid fear at all costs. The indigenous concept of worldview of fear, once the fight or flight mechanisms are no longer available, opportunity to practice a virtue. So bingo, I'm in front of the grizzly bear. I can't run. I can't fight. Instead of peeing in my pants, screaming, crying, and just freezing and whatever, and cussing the world, what virtue am I working on? Generosity? Well, maybe I'll offer him my blueberries. Patience? Maybe slowly I'll turn around. Humility, honesty, what is it, right? And that really, I've seen this in operation. All right, now, once you say, okay, what am I afraid of? That's the cognitive mind. Why is it, how does fear relate to the way I'm living in the world or this situation I'm in? And where did that fear come from? Now we jump into authority. On whose authority do I have this fear in the first place? My mom, my dad, my preacher, my teacher, something that happened to me in a traumatic event. And you start to think, wow, what is the indigenous worldview on this? Well, non-hierarchical indigenous cultures, the highest form of authority was your own reflection on lived experience under the umbrella of recognizing everything is connected. So you sit back and think, okay, if I let go of the fear, which I'm doing intellectually, and then I look at, wow, why am I still really angry at people that wear red scarves? I see now the authority for that came from the person in the red scarf that, robbed me. So bingo, I got that now. Okay, now let's move to words. What words do I use when I talk to myself? I've had executives call me for hypnosis when I was in practice many years ago. I taught hypnosis at UC Berkeley. I would say, well, why you sweat under your armpits before you go to a meeting? What do you say to yourself? I don't know. What do you mean? What do you say? Well, I say, well, I have to go to the meeting. I said, okay, I'll make the appointment for you, but just say from now on, I want to go to the meeting instead of I have to. They'll call me up and cancel because it worked. Right? They'll think I hypnotize them on the phone. Language is powerful. Kipling said it's our most powerful drug, but indigenous people don't think of it that way. They think of it as sacred vibrations. And so if I've had a woman come to me and or a man coming that's obese, wanting to get healthy. And I said, what do you say to yourself when you look in the mirror? Oh, I see that I'm fat. well, let's get our language right, because indigenous languages are verb-based, very hard to categorize. Our languages are pretty noun-based. So say that in a better way. Pretty soon they'll say, oh, I see a beautiful individual that is me and my soul, who happens to have more adipose tissue than I want right now. When they get to that stage, then the stress changes, right? So now they get this intellectually and cognitively. This is a 2-week session I'm giving you here in 5 minutes. So now they got cognitively. Okay, I can move into the indigenous worldview on fear now. I can move into it on authority. I know how to do it and what exactly I'm going to do with it. I can do that with my words. I've changed those. Now I got to go to nature. What do I do with nature? Well, how do you see nature now? Well, I don't know. It's out the back door. I don't really give a shit about it, right? So now you go, wait a minute. I'm supposed to learn from it. It's a teacher. I'm supposed to respect it. And I'm supposed to go out and maybe see something that relates to my issue, and that maybe instead of stepping on this spider, I can use Google to find out what is a spider all about. And you go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. All right, now those are the cognitive practices that you can do when you move into one of these worldview precepts, right? With just the 4: fear, authority, words, and nature. Now that you've got that, and you say, I kind of know where I am, why I got here, and how to get out of it. But willful determination won't do it. The harder you try something, the more likely it is you'll fail. That's why every world-class athlete has a sports psychologist doing hypnosis, right? Or learns it themselves, because all hypnosis is self-hypnosis. So now you use CAT, and you go into, you create a ceremony, do meditation, and begin to visualize and imagine. Like Einstein said, imagination is more powerful than knowledge. And so I write about this in Point of Departure, chapter by chapter. And I talk about it in this book that we're talking about, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, at the end of the chapters. And so, that is one way of really implementing this, with the cat-fawn connection. There's a fellow that wrote a book called, his name is Dr. Michael Fisher. It's called Point of Departure, it's called Fearless Engagement of 4 Arrows, the True Story of an Indigenous-Based Transformer. He has like 140 footnotes at the end of every chapter. So I've never read it. I'm afraid to read it. But anyway, he talks a lot about cat fawn, and if you put cat fawn, Dr. Fisher, he has a great description of it as a dehypnotizing technology for getting us out of the rut that we're in. So I think cat fawn it would be really useful for people if they go online to Kinship Worldview chart. What did I say before? It was I can't think of what it was, but anyway, it's easy. Just put in worldview chart, and there's a couple of places online. Veteran for Peace, you could even put in, and they have the worldview chart available.
Kindredfellows.org.
Yeah, Kindred Spirits, I think. Yeah, Kindred Spirits. But and you can download it. If you can't do any of that, then send me an email and I'll fire one off to you as an attachment. But if we look at the common indigenous worldview manifestations, they're non-hierarchical. They're about fearless trust in the universe. They're about a unique, socially purposeful life, about emphasis on community welfare more than personal gain. They're about respect for gender roles and fluidity. They're non-materialistic, inseparability of head and heart. Competition, which is a big one, isn't about feeling superior or winning. It's about developing positive potential so that you don't have to stop competition. I can't tell you how many people I see who, maybe that's a good one to close on, who are afraid of competition. I was interviewed yesterday by a wonderful young lady, and very much into animism and all this, and really having similar things to say about her praise for it. And I said, well, I bet you there's things, if you look and your audience looks on this left side, you're going to see things that you have a lot of work to do on. And I said, we all do. I still do. And I said, for example, let's look at the competition. And right away she says, oh, I hate competition. I hate it. And I went, bingo. That's not an indigenous worldview. Indigenous people love competition. Now the Australian Aboriginals were some of the best athletes in the world, but they weren't allowed, right? But we love it. We love it, right? But the sports that you'll see a bunch of people go out into the woods in one tribe that I know, and they'll pick up, and where there's a lot of fallen logs, and they'll all pick up a log that's pretty close to the same size, and then they go off on a horrendous 40-kilometer run or something. Well, one of the logs is always going to be heavier, and that log is going to be falling behind more and more. When it does, people are trying like heck to be to get across that finish line first. But a couple of competitors on the light log will go help the ones on the heavy one, and they're still going as hard as they can. There's 100 stories like that. I saw the Wahinkpe run when I was with the Tarahumara. 3 days of running over 100 kilometers, kicking a wooden ball and up and down a 8,000-foot canyon. It's like the biggest athletic event I've ever seen. People coming from all over that hiked for 100 miles or so, betting and drinking corn beer and betting on what team was going to come across first. Well, when it happened, the teams were ignored except for the wives, giving them food and water, and some medicine people massaging their legs. So at that time, I was pretty ignorant about sports, and I was a competitive athlete myself, and expected more hurrah, for the winners. So I asked Augustine Ramos, the 102-year-old shaman, and you can see this, if you just put in the shaman's message on YouTube, you can see my voyage into the Copper Canyon in slides, but and narrative. So I asked him, why aren't they being celebrated like we would in the United States? He must have talked for 5 minutes, but the translation of the translator was like 2 seconds. And he said, he's saying, well, somebody had to come across first. That was it. That was all, and yet, intense, right? And so, if we start looking at these things, if we've and practicing trans-spaced learning, right? That's all 3 of the Abrahamic religions, which are pretty powerful in your country, in the United States and Mexico, where I'm at, and Canada, to a lesser degree. All 3 of Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, they refer to the hypnosis as of the devil. Even though Jesus said purportedly, I cannot work my miracles where they did not believe, which I see as hypnosis. And so why do they do that? So that the power politics of religiosity can hypnotize everybody into saying, if you don't give us this and do this, then you're going to rot in hell or something. And so these things start to expand when you look at them. Even looking at personal vitality and saying, wow, personal vitality is primary. 1/3 of Americans are obese, 1/3. And you go, well, how does personal, and so, but you don't want to look at it by itself, because you've got to look at, well, how does that relate to time as cyclical? Or how does it relate to emphasis on responsibility? How does that relate to trans-spaced learning? How does that relate to words as sacred? How does that relate to inseparability of heads and heart? And you start doing that, and all of a sudden, you just take a breath and you go, you know what? I'm going to start doing yoga tomorrow, or I'm going to go running tomorrow. It just feels right now, man. So we don't know how powerful worldview is until we reflect on the worldview that is causing us not to be as happy, or not to be supporting the greater good as much as we can. And when we actually have this opportunity to see the left and right brain, the positive and negative, not in good and bad, but like the Kogi of Colombia say, it's like electricity, the positive and negative, they both are required, but in a very balanced way. And so do you think that's a good place to close? I'd like to maybe close by playing a little flute song when you're ready to say this is the last 30 seconds that will help let people know that even though we've talked about some scary things, that seeing the beauty in the world and how many things around us are still keeping their responsibility, even if other people around you are not. I'll play that little song for people.
Yeah,
But
I would
any other
absolutely love
questions?
that. No, I
All
think
right.
no, I concur with you. I think we've covered an enormous amount. I hope that others will believe what I do, which is that this is a conversation which calls to be listened to again and annotated from. There's probably one thing I would just like to say before the song, which is all of the resources that you've listed whilst we've been talking. I will find those, and by the time you listener are listening to this, you can scroll down and click on the links to them, and you can go right there. So the one thing that I would invite 4 hours you to do is, if someone is right now about to go and view and download the PDF for the 40 precepts poster that you were holding up before, what would you suggest someone does with that? You talked a little bit about sort of what you've suggested, you know, the Veterans Association do. So just as a prompt for someone listening to this that now is looking at that poster, what would you suggest they do with it?
Okay, I would say that, like, I've got mine right up here on the wall, right next to me. And and this evening, before I started this interview with you, I was thinking about the 10 teenagers that have been brought here by my daughter. And I was just looking at this and saying, wow, what is it that they were, kind of challenged children. That's why they're in the special school. What are the things that would really be most useful for them to be doing now? Based on what I think they're doing on the dominant worldview too much. So I looked at that and I went, wow, there's at least 6 of them that are really, really prominent. And I know the school is addressing some of them, but they're not really addressing them from a worldview perspective, and therefore they actually still they're addressing them in a better way, but still in ways that have more of the dominant worldview on them. And so by just looking at that, I'm able to then talk to the teachers and say, hey, I think it'll be a good time for them to come out into nature before you do any more lessons. So why don't you bring them out and we got a bunch of paddle boards here, and we'll get them into the ocean and get them over their fear of the ocean and let them, and it works like magic, right? So everybody's going to look at it and I think it'll resonate that we all are trapped in systems. And maybe somebody, intellectually goes, well, I agree with most of them on this side, but I know I am in the throes of living this way and having these priorities. How do I shift that? And then when I go to work, how do I help shift things in my place of employment? I think that it'll become kind of self-obvious. Now, I've had to do some artificial things. For example, one of the precepts, it relates to the important use of humor by Indigenous peoples. Now, when I run my lodge, I'm authorized because I did my sun dances and I'm a pipe carrier, so I can run the lodge fairly close to how I want. And I have people tell jokes in between the 4 doors. The first door, we pray for ourselves. The second door, we pray for the world. The third door, we pray for balance. And the fourth door, we give thanks. But I have people tell jokes. Well, the Lakota don't do that. That's not a thing that is traditional. Why did I add that? Because when I was on Pine Ridge living there as director of education at Oglala Lakota College, I don't think I ever left the most tragic reasons for Inipi ceremonies or purification lodge. Somebody died, or someone was stolen, a woman was stolen. I mean, it was horrible things. But I don't think I've ever left a lodge without my stomach hurting from laughing, because the people inside that are praying, and there will always be someone be able to say, well, we're gonna miss Red Feather, but gosh darn, I can't help but think that day he slipped on that banana peel, or something like that, and the humor is really a matter of surviving and thriving, right? Instead of entertainment. Well, you can't sometimes get that naturally, people will think. So I have people tell jokes in my lodge, because we don't have indigenous people coming into my lodge, for healing. The people that are from all over the world here, right? So it'll take some creativity. And like I tell my students, that's you look at this worldview chart with intention, and you'll figure out how to use it.
Okay, well, there we go. You and I are going to speak for a short time after we cease recording, but I will right here and now thank you for everything that you and Darcia have created, for everything else that you've created yourself, and for the beautiful song that you're going to take us out with.
All right. And I'll tell everyone that this was a song that was taught to me by Carlos Mackay. And the words to it are what's really important. It was women on the Trail of Tears, the forced march that Cherokee, my blooded people, were forced to walk against the Supreme Court rule because the president forced them to. And a third of the people died about, and it was very horrible, conditions. But the women sang a song that reminded the children, did you see the beautiful animals in the clouds? And how the clouds are keeping us in drinking water? Did you see the beautiful dancing grasses in the prairie and how they're spreading the leaves and giving the deer something to eat? Did you see the beautiful colors of the fish and the trout that we and the fish in the brook that we crossed, and how that fish is keeping the water clean? And did you hear the sounds of beautiful birds that are giving us ways to sing our own songs and planting the seeds? That kind of seeing the beauty, no matter how bad that situation was. And if you can just focus on how bad the situation is in where you are, if you're flooding or freezing or in fires or whatever it is that's happening in the world and wars, that part of this worldview is to remember that we are spirits in a body and that we're here to help others, and we cannot stop seeing the beauty all around.